The planet Radiance did not look like a world in crisis from orbit. It looked like someone had taken the inside of a geode the size of a continent and turned it inside out, letting all the light escape at once. Crystal towers caught the system's white-blue star and threw it back in fractured arcs. Mountain ranges glittered along their ridgelines like the edge of a blade held up to a window. Even the oceans refracted rather than reflected, breaking the starlight into shifting prisms that moved with the currents beneath. Corvin Holt pressed his face briefly against the shuttle's porthole glass, the way a man does when he thinks no one is watching, and thought it looks like a circuit board someone wrapped in jewelry. He had spent 11 years at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum in Washington, restoring instruments that had been to the edge of the solar system and come back broken in ways no one had anticipated. He knew what engineered beauty looked like. He knew the difference between something built to impress and something built to function. Radiance from up here looked like it might be both. He was not yet sure which would make his job harder. The guild contact had reached him in Flagstaff on a Tuesday. He had been in his workshop behind the house, a converted garage with better lighting than most operating rooms, working on a pre-Columbian bronze fitting that a museum in Santa Fe had given up on. The comm signal had come through at 11 in the morning, and by noon he had accepted the commission. Not because of the money, though the money was significant, because of one line in the mission brief that no one had written deliberately, but that had caught him the way honest things catch a person who has spent too long around dishonest ones. Object has sustained structural compromise. Previous consultants declined engagement. That was the line. That was always the line that moved him. The shuttle docked against a crystalline tower that rose from the palace complex like a column of frozen light. As Corvin stepped out onto the receiving platform, he felt the faint vibration of the city beneath his boots. Not mechanical. Something deeper. The planetary grid he knew from the briefing documents ran through the substrate of the entire capital. It was always running. It had been running for 300 years. And for the past 11 days since the coup attempt, it had been running with a missing piece. The delegation that met him wore robes threaded with metallic fiber that caught the light with every movement. Their ears were long, elegantly tapered, and they angled in ways that Corvin had already learned to read as a secondary language. Right now, they were angled sharply back, which in his 11 hours of cultural preparation, he had noted meant something between formal reserve and active disapproval. He extended his hand to the tallest figure. The figure looked at it with the careful consideration of someone encountering a local custom they had heard about, but never expected to actually witness. "Corvin Holt," he said, "Flagstaff, Arizona. I fix old things that people stop believing in." No one responded immediately. One younger official blinked twice in rapid succession, which Corvin noted and filed away. "You are the artisan recommended by the Interstellar Guild," said the tall figure eventually. "That's a dignified way to put it." "Yes. The commission is sensitive." "They usually are," Corvin said, "when someone calls me." They escorted him through corridors that had been grown rather than constructed crystal walls that carried the faintest inner luminescence, the kind of glow that was not light exactly, but more like the memory of light held inside stone. Holographic sigils drifted at the intersections, cycling through languages as he passed. He kept his expression neutral and his eyes moving, cataloging load-bearing structures, energy conduits, the subtle pulse of grid current beneath ornamental facing. He had understood early in his career that beautiful things are never only beautiful. There is always a system underneath. The throne chamber opened before him like the interior of a prism. The dome above was transparent, pulling the city's skyline into the room towers and terraces, and the faint auroral shimmer of the defense grid visible as a soft luminescence against the outer atmosphere. The floor was dark star metal, polished to a finish that turned every footstep into a quiet echo. And at the center of the room, on a pedestal of the same dark metal, rested the crown. Even damaged, it commanded the space. The framework rose in a series of asymmetric spires, each tipped with a gemstone the size of a large river stone. Each stone calibrated to a slightly different resonance frequency. The briefing documents had told him, though the documents had not explained what that meant in practice. Veins of conductive alloy threaded through the structure like lightning, caught mid-strike and held there permanently. The design was old, not antique in the way that suggested decline, old in the way that suggested it had outlasted every other approach. One side bore a fracture line running along the inner arc. The central gemstone was clouded its interior, lattice destabilized the usual clarity, replaced by a dim and uneven glow that pulsed irregularly. Micro-scarring along the base told the story of an energy discharge absorbed at far beyond ceremonial tolerances. Corvin circled it, slowly, hands clasped behind his back, not touching. He had made a practice of not touching first. Things that had been through what this thing had been through deserved the courtesy of being looked at before being handled. He said nothing for a while. Then quietly, "You held on for someone." A voice behind him said, "The crown protected its wearer." He turned. Queen Alara stood at the far end of the chamber. She was not what he had expected, though he had not expected anything specific. She wore a fitted uniform the color of deep cobalt, structured at the shoulders, threaded with the faint circuitry that seemed woven into all garments on radiance at a certain level of formality. No crown, no ceremonial armor, nothing that said ruler except the way she stood, which said it completely, the way a well-built bridge says load-bearing without any signage. Her hair was dark braided back from her temples with precise economy. Her face, framed by the elegant taper of those long alien ears, held the kind of intelligence that organizes itself into stillness rather than animation. She was watching him the way he had watched the crown. He bowed, not deeply. "Enough. Your Majesty, you may rise." A pause. "I was told you would want to examine it alone." "I did want that," he agreed, "but I'm also told I report directly to you, so." Her ears shifted fractionally, the angle changing in a way he could not yet read. "That is correct." "Then I'll say my first impressions now and save us both a formal briefing." He turned back to the crown. "It's a remarkable piece of engineering. Disguised as regalia, which is either very clever or very honest, depending on your perspective." "It is both." He glanced at her. There was something in the way she said it. A weight he had heard in the word both before from people who meant something particular by it. He filed that away too. He set his kit on the floor and removed a compact scanner, a Smithsonian-era device he had modified so many times over the years that its original manufacturer would not have recognized it. He activated it and let the micro-drone cluster deploy 12 small units, fanning out in practice formation, and projecting a layered holographic map of the crown's structure between him and the pedestal. The fracture line appeared in red. The energy conduits appeared in gold. The inner lattice appeared in pale blue, and it was the inner lattice that made him go still. The geometry was extraordinary. Not simple symmetry, not the elegant repetition of a designer who understood beauty, but not function. This was something deeper. A recursive pattern of load distribution nodes connected by filament, channels so fine they registered at the edge of his scanner's resolution. It was the kind of structural architecture you found in very old things made by people who had been thinking about the problem for generations. Not designed in one session. Evolved. He leaned closer to the fracture. High Counselor Dravith had entered the chamber at some point, taking a position to the side with two other senior officials whose names Corvin had not yet learned. He was aware of them in his peripheral vision, aware of the quality of attention they directed at him, which was the attention of people who had strong opinions about what he was about to say. "The fracture runs along a stress channel," Corvin said, still studying the projection. "Pre-existing. See the micro-fatigue pattern here and here." He indicated 2 points with a light stylus. "The energy discharge from the coup didn't create this. It followed it, like water finding a crack in rock." Silence. Then Dravith's voice, measured and deliberate. "You are suggesting the crown was compromised before the attack." "I'm not suggesting. I'm observing." Corvin straightened and looked at the projection more carefully, working backward through the fatigue signatures, reading them the way you read tree rings, the way you read the strata of stone. Each material failure left a record if you knew how to look. This degradation pattern is consistent with repeated low-level stress over an extended period. Not recent, not months. We're looking at structural fatigue that began. He ran a calculation on the scanner's secondary display. Approximately 230 years ago, give or take a decade. The chamber went very quiet. Corvin did not look up from the projection. He had found over years of this work that the moment after you deliver an unexpected technical finding is not the moment to watch the room. The projection would not look back at him. The room would. He preferred to control where his attention went. That would place the origin of the damage, Ilara said slowly, during the reign of the sixth queen. If your records are accurate, yes. A pause that lasted longer than a pause usually does when the answer to a question is simple. He did look up then because the quality of the silence had changed. Ilara was not looking at Draveth or at her other counselors. She was looking at the crown, and the expression on her face was not the expression of a monarch receiving a structural report. It was something more interior than that. Recognition, maybe, or the stillness that settles when something you feared turns out to be true, and the truth is somehow less terrible than the fearing was. The sixth queen, Ilara said, and the words came out with a weight that suggested she was not saying them to the room. She was saying them to herself. Corvin waited. She turned to Draveth. The historical records from that period, the coup attempt in the 43rd year of her reign. Draveth's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. There was an incident, yes, it was contained. Was the crown examined afterward? A longer pause. The court records indicate it was assessed and declared ceremonially intact. Ceremonially intact, Corvin said, is not the same as structurally sound. He kept his voice level. This was not the time for Arizona directness. This was the time for the kind of precision that left no room for argument. A surface assessment would not have caught micro-fatigue in the inner load channels. Whoever examined it either didn't have the equipment or didn't want to find what I found. Ilara's eyes remained on the crown. When she spoke, her voice had the quality of someone working something out. In real time, a person doing the arithmetic of history and arriving at a number they had not expected. She knew, Ilara said, or she suspected, and she chose not to repair it. That would be consistent with what I'm seeing, Corvin said carefully, because to repair it would have been to admit it was damaged. He did not respond immediately. He had found over 23 years of this work that some observations are best left as questions rather than answered. The objects he repaired held stories, and the people who owned them usually already knew the stories. They just needed someone to hand the story back to them in a form they could look at directly. Ilara turned away from the crown and looked at him. Her ears angled forward, not the reserved backward angle of the delegation at the dock. Forward, attention, assessment. Clear the chamber, she said. Everyone except Drake. Holt, Corvin said. Holt. A pause. Leave us. Draveth's ears pulled sharply back. Your Majesty protocol requires that. Clear the chamber, counselor. It was not said loudly. It was said with the quietness belonging to someone who has not raised their voice because they have never needed to. Draveth bowed and withdrew. The others followed. The doors sealed with a sound like a cord held briefly and then released. The chamber settled into a different kind of silence. Not empty. The crown still pulsed with its irregular glow. The hollow projection still mapped its fractures in patient blue and red. The city continued its luminous business beyond the dome, but the quality of the air had changed. Whatever had been performance in the room had gone with the audience. Ilara walked to the pedestal and stood before the crown. She did not touch it. She looked at it the way Corvin had looked at it when he first came in, taking its measure, deciding something. She was afraid, Ilara said, not a question. Most people who hide damage are, Corvin said, the sixth queen. Ilara's voice had lost its formal register. Not informal, just honest. She was considered resolute, decisive. The histories describe her as the queen who stabilized the Western territories during the long conflict. They do not describe her as frightened. Resolute people are frightened all the time, Corvin said. They're just better at the cover charge. Ilara glanced at him with something that was not quite a smile but was in the same neighborhood. Then she looked back at the crown. She carried this for 31 more years with a fracture in it, Ilara said, and no one knew. She knew. Yes, a breath. She knew. The city moved outside, unhurried, luminous, doing what cities do when they are not aware that something significant is happening in a room near their center. Corvin checked his scanner readings and let the silence have its space. He had learned that too. Silence in this kind of work was not empty. It was structural. It held weight that words would displace if you used them carelessly. He was preparing to suggest they move the crown to his workshop when the scanner emitted a tone it had not emitted before. He looked at the display. The crown's central gemstone was doing something the briefing documents had not mentioned. The irregular pulse had changed rhythm. It was no longer irregular. It was cycling, and the cycle was not random. His scanner flagged it as a data pattern, then flagged it again as a resonance signature, and then produced a reading that he looked at for a long moment before he said anything. "Your Majesty," she turned. "Your crown is broadcasting." Her expression shifted. "Explain." He adjusted the projection, expanding the view of the central node, pulling the hollow display out from its structural frame and into the frequency map. Layered readings appeared in the air between them, dense with data. He read it the way he read old objects, not mechanically, but with the patient attention of someone who understood that old things communicate in registers that modern instruments almost miss. "The gem is emitting neural resonance patterns," he said. "Stored, not generated. It's replaying something." He calibrated the display and let the image resolve. "It stores bioelectric imprints from coronations, from crisis activations. Every time this crown carried its full charge through a human, or in your case, an alien neural field, it kept a record." The image in the projection resolves slowly the way shapes emerge from static when you know what to look for. A silhouette, a figure, long ears, a posture he had not seen before, upright, but different from Alara's uprightness. Older, carrying something differently. "That is the sixth queen," Alara said. Her voice was very quiet. Corvin said nothing. The image held for 3 seconds and then dissolved back into the pattern, the way a face seen in firelight dissolves when the flame shifts. But for those 3 seconds, it had been unmistakably a person, and the posture had told its own story. Not the resolute and decisive queen of the history books. Someone standing at the intersection of duty and exhaustion, holding both upright by main force. "She's been in there," Alara said, "all this time." "All 9 of them by the resonance count," Corvin said. "Every queen who wore this crown at full amplification left something inside it. Not memory exactly, more like a record of the neural state, who they were at the moments that cost them the most." Alara's ears angled backward in the slow, involuntary shift that he was beginning to associate not with disapproval, but with something being felt rather than thought. She stood completely still. On any other face in any other setting, he would have said, "She is trying not to let this matter as much as it does." He powered down the projection and began carefully repacking his scanner. "I'll need to transfer the crown to my workshop," he said. "Full structural access, controlled environment, stable gravity. I can have preliminary repair models ready within 24 hours. Alara did not respond immediately. She was still looking at the space where the projection had been, where the image of the sixth queen had stood briefly and then returned to data. "I need to ask you something," she said. "Ask. If you repair it, if you change the inner lattice the way you're describing, add these filaments, redistribute the architecture." She paused, choosing words with the care of someone who has learned that precision matters more than speed. "Will it still be theirs?" Corbin stopped packing and stood up straight. He had been asked versions of this question many times, in many forms, in many languages, and by many kinds of people. The heirloom question, the authenticity question, the question that was never really about the object. He looked at her, and she looked back at him with the full weight of someone who needed an honest answer more than a comfortable one. "It'll be yours," he said. First time that's actually been true. The silence that followed was different from the silences before it. Not empty, not heavy. Possibility, maybe. The kind of quiet that exists just before a decision that cannot be undone. She turned to face him fully then, and her ears came forward again, all the way forward, the way they had not been since the chamber cleared. "Begin," she said. "Tonight, if you can." "I can." He lifted his kit. "One request." "Yes." "Whoever monitors my workshop, tell them to breathe normally. The gasping is distracting." Something shifted in her expression. Not a laugh, but the architecture of a laugh, the structure that a laugh would build if it had permission. "I will pass that along," she said. The workshop they had assigned him overlooked a terrace of living crystal that caught the city's light and threw it back, changed. In the early evening, radiance performed its usual conversion of sunset into spectrum towers, refracting the dying light into running colors that painted the workshop walls in slow drifts of amber and violet and pale gold. By the time Corvin had the environment field calibrated and the crown secured in its containment cradle above the central table, the city had shifted to its nighttime register interior luminescence, a deep and patient glow from within every structure, the defense grid visible as faint ribbons of light above the upper atmosphere. He stood at the table and looked at the crown in its cradle and felt the thing he always felt at this stage of a commission. Not excitement, not pressure, something quieter than both. A focused clarity that arrives when a problem is real and the tools are good and the time ahead belongs entirely to the work. He deployed his full scanner array, 12 drones this time, forming a complete sphere around the crown and projecting a three-dimensional structural map that filled the workshop with intersecting light. Every fracture, every stress point, every energy conduit and memory node and load-bearing joint. The inner lattice expanded in the display, like a city seen from altitude, more complex than it appeared from the outside, more deliberate than complexity usually is. He began with the fracture. He had repaired fractures in bronze bell frames from the 14th century. He had restored the structural chassis of a communications relay that had been struck by micrometeorites on its third pass around Jupiter. He had worked on a ceremonial sword that had been buried in the same family's land for 6 generations and had come up carrying the kind of damage that only time and pressure and darkness could make. He understood fractures. This one was the record of a long, slow decision made over centuries. Not a sudden failure, a gradual yielding to load that was never properly distributed. The original designers had built for ceremony, and ceremony is predictable. Ceremonial loads are the same loads applied in the same order on the same occasions in the same places. Under those conditions, the design was flawless. It had lasted 9 reigns and 3 centuries without visible failure. But the world is not ceremonial. Crisis is not ceremonial. The people who wear crowns are not only ceremonial, whatever the crowns are told to expect. He worked for 3 hours on the structural analysis before he touched the crown itself. The first contact was with a non-conductive probe reading the material properties of the star metal framework at the fracture point. The alloy was unlike anything in his experience, dense and responsive at once, carrying the faint vibration of the grid connection even in a contained and isolated state, as if the crown remembered where it was supposed to be, even when it was being held away from its place. He was calibrating a stress model when the scanner emitted the tone again. He straightened. The central gem was cycling. The same pattern from the throne chamber, but slower now, more deliberate, as if it had settled into something. The display showed the resonance signature building in layers, one frequency over another, the way you layer readings when you want to compare multiple data sources simultaneously. He watched it. 9 separate resonance signatures. Stacked, not identical. Each one distinct in amplitude and frequency, and what his scanner categorized as emotional valence, a term he had always found presumptuous for a machine to use, but which, looking at these 9 distinct imprint patterns, he could not argue with. The first was controlled, careful, precise, old, pre-industrial in its simplicity, a queen who had worn the crown before the planetary grid existed, when the amplification function had been purely ceremonial and the defenses had been walls and weather. The sixth was different from the others. He could see it clearly in the data, the way you can hear a wrong note in a chord even before you identify which note it is. The sixth signature was compressed, tightened. The frequency modulation showed the unmistakable pattern of sustained load without release. Someone who had held everything in for 31 years and asked the crown to do the same. The ninth was the most recent. It overlapped with the others, but did not quite integrate. It sat alongside them like a person standing at the edge of a group photograph, technically present, not yet belonging. He understood then why Alara had asked her question. She was not asking about the crown. She was asking whether she belonged in it, whether there was room for her in a lineage that had been accumulating weight for 3 centuries, whether the thing she was being asked to carry was something she could hold without breaking, or something that had already decided how she would need to stand. He closed the scanner display and sat down on the work stool and looked at the crown for a while without any instruments between them. Then he got back to work. It was past midnight by the time he had completed the initial structural model and begun the first filament calculations. The city outside had settled into its deep night rhythm, the luminescence lower, the grid's aurora faint but continuous above the atmosphere. Somewhere in the palace, he knew Queen Alara was doing whatever queens did in the hours when the court had gone quiet, managing a world that was running on a fractured system, holding the line while the thing that was supposed to hold it was on his table in pieces. He ran the first filament simulation and watched the stress distribution model respond. The load that had been concentrated in the central node spread outward along the adaptive threads, evening out, finding balance across the full structure rather than asking any one point to carry everything. The fracture line in the simulation showed minimal strain. He ran it again with a stronger load. The simulation held. He ran it with the load parameters from the briefing document's description of the coup, attempt the energy discharge that had been intended to kill and had been absorbed instead by the crown, and watch the simulated filaments flex and redirect and distribute without collapsing. He sat back on the stool. Outside radiance hummed quietly beneath its luminous sky, running on a partial system waiting. The crown on the table above him pulsed with its soft and patient light, its 9 voices quiet, for now, its fracture held open by careful instrumentation that would make the repair possible. Corvin Holt from Flagstaff, Arizona, who had spent 23 years fixing things that other people had given up on, looked at the most complex object he had ever been asked to repair and thought about a queen who had stood in the throne chamber that afternoon with the stillness of someone doing arithmetic on herself and not liking the answer she was getting. He thought about what she had asked. Will it still be theirs? And his own answer, which had been honest, it'll be yours. First time, that's actually been true. He turned back to his instruments and began the work that would make that answer possible. The third day arrived the way days arrive on a world where the light never fully stops moving, gradually with a kind of luminous inevitability, the crystal towers catching the system star's first angle and throwing it sideways across the city in long amber lines that crossed and recrossed until the streets below looked like the surface of a complicated equation. Corvin had been awake for most of it, not from anxiety, from the deep absorption that comes when a problem has enough depth to hold a person's attention through the hours when attention is hardest to sustain. He had made progress on the filament lattice. The primary arc was reinforced along its full length, now the adaptive threads woven through the original framework with a precision that had cost him 14 hours and 2 recalibrations when the star metal's resonance properties turned out to behave differently under the workshop's stabilized gravity than under the throne chamber's ceremonial field. He had accounted for that. He had then discovered the inner load channels had a secondary harmonic he had not modeled, and he had accounted for that too. By dawn, he had a structure that was beginning to look less like a damaged artifact and more like something in the process of becoming what it had always been trying to be. He was recalibrating the central node housing when the door chimed. "Enter," he called. Queen Alara came in without her attendants again. He was beginning to understand this was a choice rather than an oversight. She wore a different uniform from the previous nights, the same structural simplicity, the same faint circuitry at the seams, but the color deeper. The cobalt of the first night had been formal diplomatic. This was something closer to working dress. Her hair was braided back with less ceremony, and there was a quality to her movement as she crossed the workshop that suggested the day had been long, in ways that had nothing to do with hours. She looked at the crown first, always the crown first. He had noticed that. "You've reinforced the primary arc," she said. "The first 3 filaments are set. I'm working on the node housing now." She moved to the table's edge, studying the holographic projection he had left running the structural model, rotating slowly in the air above the crown's containment field. Her long ears angled forward, reading the display with the focused attention of someone who had made herself learn what she needed to know. "The waveform is smoother," she said. "The load distribution is improving. The filaments are doing what they're supposed to do." He adjusted a calibration point on the secondary display. "The fracture site is stable. It won't propagate further." She was quiet for a moment, watching the model turn. Outside, the city's nighttime luminescence had settled into its deep register, the kind of glow that suggested the whole world was breathing slowly. "Dravith submitted a formal objection today," she said. "Not as complaint, as information delivered to someone she had decided to include in the accounting. I assumed he would. He cited precedent from 3 separate reign periods. He is thorough." "What did you tell him?" She looked at the crown rather than at Corvin. "I told him I had examined the objections and would take them under consideration." "And will you?" "I already have." A pause. I considered them for approximately 4 seconds. He did not smile, but the impulse was there. He returned to his calibration work, and she remained at the table's edge. And for a time, the only sounds in the workshop were the low hum of the containment field, and the quiet clicks of his instruments, and the distant, patient breathing of the city outside. This had become the shape of the evenings. He had not planned it. She had not announced it. On the second night, she had arrived with archived data he had requested stayed to explain the historical resonance logs and had still been there 2 hours later. When he had looked up from the work and found her reading schematics on the secondary display with the concentration of someone who intended to understand rather than merely supervise. On the third night, she had come without a stated reason, and he had not asked for one. She had pulled the secondary stool to the far side of the table and sat with the distance of someone who understood the difference between watching work and interrupting it, and he had found that the work went better with her presence in the room than without it, which surprised him enough that he noted it internally and then set it aside to examine later. He was 2 hours into the fourth night's work when the crown did something new. He was inside the node housing calibration, threading the microfilament guide through the secondary channel when the central gemstone shifted its pulse. Not the irregular sputtering of the first day, not the 9-layered resonance recording he had mapped on the first night. This was a single signal, clean and directed cycling with the deliberate rhythm of something that had been waiting for a specific condition to be met. His scanner flagged it before he registered it consciously. He set down the filament guide and looked at the display. The signature was unlike the stored imprint recordings. Those had been retrospective, the crown replaying what it had captured. This was projective. The crown was generating something outward, not inward. A frequency pattern he had not seen in the structural data, not in the briefing documents, not in the 3 days of analysis that had preceded this moment. He pulled up the full spectral display and ran a comparison against everything in his database. The comparison returned a match he had not expected. He said, "Alara." She was at the secondary display. She looked up at his tone, and her ears came forward immediately. "Come and look at this." She crossed to the primary table and stood beside him, close enough that he could see the precise way her attention shifted when she read the display, the small involuntary adjustment of her ears that happened when something required full concentration. "What is it doing?" she asked. "It's activating a function I didn't know existed." He isolated the signal and ran the comparison again on the secondary display so she could see it. "This frequency pattern matches a record in your royal archives. I had access to the full resonance logs, historical coronation data, defensive activations going back 260 years. He pointed to the match result. "This pattern appears once before. 93 years ago during a succession crisis in the third year of the 7th Queen's reign. An internal threat, not an external one." She read the display carefully. A warning system. Old, pre-grid by the structural signature, built into the crown's original architecture, not added later. He pulled up the frequency analysis. "It's been dormant for 93 years. It activated 3 minutes ago." The room was quiet. Alara looked at the crown, and the crown pulsed with its clean, directed signal, steady and patient, a single note held in the dark. "What does it respond to?" she asked. Her voice was level. The question was precise and direct. The question of someone who has trained herself to ask for information before she allows herself to feel about it. He ran the correlation analysis he had already started before she reached the table. The results came back in segments cross-referencing the activation trigger against every variable the scanner could read in the room: environmental, structural, electromagnetic. The correlation was not with any of those. "It responds to bioelectric instability," he said, "specifically the neural field of the crown's designated wearer." He looked at her directly. "It activated when you came into the room." She did not move. Her expression did not change in any way that an observer further than 3 feet away would have detected. But he was 3 feet away, and he saw what happened in the 2 seconds after he finished the sentence. The slight change in the set of her jaw. The almost imperceptible shift of her ears. Not back, not sideways, but in a direction that seemed less like a signal and more like something folding inward. She had known, not the technical details, not the mechanism, but somewhere in the architecture of herself she had already known. "It recognized something in you," he said. He kept his voice the same way he kept his hands when he worked on delicate things, steady, without pressure, without urgency. Not an external threat, the designers built this for a different kind of crisis. The kind that happens inside the person wearing the crown, not outside the palace. She turned away from the display. She walked to the terrace window and stood looking out at the city's nighttime glow. Her back to him, her hands at her sides, neither clasped nor tense. Just present. He did not follow. He returned his attention to the calibration work because the work needed to continue and because he had found that people in the middle of something real do not generally need to be accompanied. They need to not be interrupted. After a while, she said, Queen Marevin built the original framework. The fifth queen, yes. He had studied the archive schematics. The primary structure is attributed to her reign. She was a military strategist before she was a queen. She expanded Radiance's territories through 3 consecutive campaigns. The histories describe her as aggressive in the way they mean it as a compliment. A pause. She was also widowed in the first year of her reign, ruled for 40 years alone, and twice suppressed internal factions that believed she was insufficient. Another pause shorter. She understood, perhaps, that external enemies are not the only kind. That would explain the design choice, Corvin said. Alara turned from the window. She did not return to the table immediately. She stood in the space between the window and the work surface, and the city's light came through the crystal walls and caught the edges of her ears in silver, and for a moment she looked like the person she was when she was not performing being the person she was. When did you understand that it was responding to me, she said, not to an external threat? When I ran the correlation, he said, 3 minutes ago. You said it without softening it? I thought you'd prefer that. She looked at him for a moment. Then she crossed back to the table and sat down on the secondary stool, and the quality of her sitting down was different from previous nights. Less contained, less arranged. My grandmother, she said, was considered the most disciplined ruler in 4 generations. She was crowned at 26 and ruled for 38 years without a public moment of visible uncertainty. The histories treat this as her greatest quality. She looked at the crown. I was raised understanding that control was the inheritance, that the crown carried discipline forward through the lineage, and the discipline was what made the power legitimate. Corvin set down his filament tool. He did not do it to indicate he was listening. He set it down because the work required both hands and he needed to be still. After the coup attempt, she said, I held every briefing. I made every necessary decision. I reviewed every security protocol and signed every order and appeared before the court every morning as required. Her voice was the voice of someone reciting facts precise without embellishment. And every morning between the moment I woke and the moment I appeared, I spent approximately 6 minutes being afraid that the crown had chosen better than I deserved. The workshop held her words. Outside the city breathed its slow, luminous breath. Corvin thought for a moment. He thought about a specific thing, not an abstract principle or a crafted response. A specific afternoon in a workshop in Silver City, New Mexico, when he had been 29 years old and had spent 3 days trying to understand why a silver pocket watch from the late 19th century kept losing time when every component was mechanically sound. I worked on a watch once, he said, my grandfather's. He'd carried it his whole life, and after he passed, my father had it, and then it came to me. Silver Case 17 jewel movement made in New Hampshire around 1887. Beautiful piece. It ran fine until it didn't, and when I looked at it, everything was intact. Escapement mainspring gear train. Nothing broken. She was listening. Took me 3 days to figure out the problem wasn't inside the watch at all. My father had been winding it past capacity every morning. Same thing his father had done, same thing his father before him, all the way back, all of them thinking you wound it to the stop, you'd guaranteed it would run. What they'd actually done was put the mainspring under constant tension it was never designed to hold. The watch ran, but it ran under the kind of load that wears things out from the inside. He picked up the filament tool again. The mechanism was fine. The problem was what the people who loved it thought caring for it required. Alara was very still. I regulated the mainspring, he said. It kept perfect time for another 40 years. It's in a museum in Albuquerque now. She looked at him, and he continued working, and the silence between them was the silence of 2 people who have just arrived at the same location from different directions. "You are not describing the watch," she said. "I'm always describing the watch," he said. "I just fix things." He thought she might say something more. She did not. She sat for another hour while he worked, and the crown pulsed its clean warning signal, and at some point the signal shifted, cycling down from its alert frequency into something closer to baseline, and as if the thing it had been alerting toward had moved or changed or been in some small way addressed. He did not mention this, but he noted it. On the fifth night, he completed the memory node redistribution. It was the most technically demanding part of the repair, more complex even than the filament threading because the memory nodes were not structural in the conventional sense. They did not bear load. They bore something else, and the something else had to be handled differently from metal and alloy and conductive channel. He had spent the fourth day building a containment and transfer apparatus from components in his kit, and from two items he had requisitioned from the Palace Archive: a resonance stabilizer the archivist Solon had produced from a storage unit, with the expression of a person handing over a family heirloom to someone they did not entirely trust. Corvin had treated the stabilizer accordingly, which seemed to help. The redistribution process required separating each imprint node from the central cluster without losing the resonance signature it contained, transferring it along the new adaptive filament channels, and re-anchoring it in a distributed pattern that would allow the 9 signatures to coexist without the interference feedback that had caused the overload during the coup. In practice, this meant 8 hours of work so fine and sustained that by the end of it, he could feel the fatigue that lives between the shoulder blades, and in the tendons of the hands, the fatigue of sustained precision. Elara arrived at the workshop in the early evening of the 5th day, while he was in the final stage of the redistribution. "Don't touch anything," he said without looking up. "I had no intention of touching anything," she said, which was the same thing she had said on the 4th night, when he had said it then too, and the 3rd night before that, which meant it had become a ritual between them, without either of them deciding it should be. She settled at the secondary stool and opened the archive display she had been reviewing in parallel with his work, the historical resonance logs that documented previous full activations of the crown. He had found them useful as reference data. She had found them useful for reasons he suspected had less to do with data and more to do with the slow and necessary work of understanding the thing she had been asked to inherit. He was 40 minutes into the final node transfer when the crown did what he had not anticipated. The central gemstone, which had been reduced to a single dim thread of glow, while the nodes were in transit through the filament channels, flared without warning to a brightness that lit the workshop from above like a second ceiling coming to life. Not violent, not the chaotic surge of the coup discharge, not the anxious, irregular pulse of the first days. Something more deliberate than both. A controlled release, the brightness of a room where all the lights come on at once because the house has decided it is time. The holographic projection expanded outward from the crown, past the containment field's usual boundary, filling the workshop with layered translucent figures. 9 of them. He had seen them one at a time in the earlier sessions, the isolated signatures resolving briefly into silhouettes before dissolving back to data. This was different. All 9 simultaneously present in the room as clearly as the furniture, each one distinct in posture and proportion, in the specific way they held themselves in the space that had once required holding. The first was old, wearing a crown variation he did not recognize, a simpler framework that predated the current design by what the archive dates had told him were at least 8 generations of modification. Her posture was the posture of someone who had built something from the beginning and understood both its weight and its purpose. The 5th was Queen Marevin, and the archive identification was not necessary because everything about her bearing announced it. She stood the way people stand when they have been under fire and have learned that the correct response to incoming is to become a harder target, compressed, alert, built for endurance. The 6th was smaller than the others in projection, or perhaps it was only the quality of her presence that made her seem smaller, the way a person looks when they have been carrying something private and enormous for too long. She stood slightly apart from the group, as if even in data she had maintained the distance she had maintained in life. And then the 9th. The 9th was not Elara because Elara was standing beside him at the table. But the 9th was Alara's signature, the most recent full activation record captured when the crown had last been fully charged at her coronation 3 years before the coup. The ninth stood with the careful uprightness of someone who had been taught what standing correctly meant and was performing it exactly, and the performance was perfect. And the cost of performing it perfectly was written in every line of how she held herself. Corvin watched Alara look at it. He had learned in this work to watch the people rather than the objects when the objects did something significant. The objects did not process what was happening. The people did. She looked at the ninth figure for a long time, long enough that the silence in the room changed from attentive to something deeper. Then she looked at the sixth figure, the queen with the fracture and the 31 years of maintenance denied, standing slightly outside the group, slightly separate, the cost of that separateness as visible in data as it had been in life. Then she looked at all nine together, and whatever happened in the moment when she took them in as a complete image rather than individual records, whatever arithmetic she completed in that pause, something in her face changed in a way that was not a single emotion, but the release of several emotions that had been held together under pressure for longer than they should have been. She turned away from the projection. He kept his attention on the crown, on the technical work of the moment, on the calibration readings that required monitoring. This was the work, not the feelings in the room, the work in his hands. He kept his attention there and let her have the space was for. The workshop was quiet for a while. He heard her exhale, a single controlled breath, the kind that is not a song and is not quite a breath either, but something in between that the body sometimes requires when it is processing something the mind has not yet entirely caught up to. "They're not judging," she said. Her voice was very quiet. "No," he said. "I have spent 3 years afraid they were." She paused. The sixth especially. I felt the weight of what she chose when the coup struck, the silence, the endurance. I thought it was what was required of me. The projection still held its 9 figures in the workshop's quiet air. He watched the calibration readings and let them settle. She was wrong about what she had to carry, he said. She made the best decision she could with the belief she had. The belief was wrong. And mine, he ran a final check on the node transfer and confirmed the distribution was stable before he answered. He wanted to answer her correctly, which meant he needed to be certain first that he was not answering from the part of himself that wanted to reassure. She did not need reassurance. She needed something truer than that. "You asked me on the second night if it would still be theirs after I changed it," he said. "I told you it would be yours for the first time." He looked at the 9 figures in the projection. "That was the right answer. But here's the rest of it. It being yours doesn't mean it stops being theirs. The ninth queen in that group is the most recent record of who you were when you were crowned. The woman who wore it tonight will add a new record. And the difference between those 2 records is what the next queen will see when she looks into the crown's data and tries to understand what she's carrying." Alara was very still. "You're not the end of the lineage," he said. "You're the turn, the place where it stopped, breaking under the weight it was accumulating and started distributing it correctly. That's not failure dressed up as success. That's actually what the good ones do." The projection held its 9 figures for another few seconds. Then the crown, having discharged whatever it had needed to discharge, cycled down its output, and the silhouettes dimmed slowly, gently, without drama, the way lights go down in a room at the end of something rather than the beginning. The 9 signatures settled back into the distributed memory nodes along the new adaptive filaments, dispersed and stable, no longer clustered in the single fragile point that had collapsed under load. The workshop returned to its ambient glow. Alara stood at the table and she was crying, and she made no attempt to hide it and no attempt to perform it. She simply stood there in the quiet of the room and let it be what it was. A person feeling what had been accumulating for 3 years find its way to the surface at last, the long overdue release of a mainspring that had finally been given permission to run at the tension it was designed for rather than the tension it had been forced to hold. He kept working, not to ignore it, to honor it by treating it as something that did not require management. He noted the calibration readings. He confirmed the node distribution was holding. He made 2 minor adjustments to the filament anchoring that he had been planning to address regardless. After a while, she said very quietly, "Your grandfather's watch." "Did it know," she said, "that it was being wound too tight? Is that a sensible question to ask about a watch?" "Probably not," he said. "But the answer would be yes if it were. The evidence was all there in the wear patterns. It had been telling anyone who could read it for 40 years. He paused. Things no. They just need someone who knows how to look. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Corvin. He looked up. Thank you, she said. Not the formal acknowledgement of a ruler to a contractor. The other kind. The kind that comes from the same place that had just been crying and had not entirely finished. He nodded once, then he returned to the calibration work, and she stayed at the secondary stool, and the workshop held them both in its careful light, and outside radiance moved through its nighttime cycle, steady and luminous, unaware that something in a room near its center had just redistributed its most important load. He had not expected her on the sixth night. He was wrong about that. He had been working for 4 hours when the chime sounded at 2 in the morning, and when he opened the door, she was standing in the corridor in a uniform that was not the working dress of recent nights, but it's something simpler. Still the kind of thing a person wears when they have stopped deciding what to wear and simply reached for what was closest. Her hair was only half braided, her ears were in the forward angle he now associated with full attention, but there was a quality beneath it tonight that was different from the nights before. She looked like someone who had been sitting with something alone for long enough and had decided finally not to do that anymore. He stepped back from the door. She came in. She did not look at the crown immediately. She looked at him. I need to tell you something, she said. I have not told anyone else. He set down the tool in his hand carefully and gave her his complete attention. She stood in the center of the workshop with the city's deep night glow behind her through the crystal walls, and she held herself with the dignity of a person who is about to say a true thing and has decided that the dignity has to come from the truth itself rather than from any arrangement of posture around it. When the blast struck, she said, when the coup was at its worst, when the crown absorbed the discharge and the chamber was burning, and my guards were calling for the evacuation protocol, there was one thought I had in the first second before any other thought arrived. A pause so precise it felt measured. Not about my people, not about the grid, not about succession or defense or duty. She looked at him steadily. I thought they were right about me. The workshop was very quiet. I thought every faction that had ever doubted my right to that crown had seen something I had refused to see about myself. That the attack had not been a crime against radiance. It had been a correction. He held very still, not because he did not have a response, because this was not the moment for his response. This was the moment for the words she had just said to exist in the room without being immediately managed or redirected. She held his gaze. I have done everything correctly since then. Every briefing, every order, every public appearance, everything that was required. A pause. But I have done it as a person who believed in the deepest part of herself that she was performing something she had not actually earned. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, the best things I've ever repaired were the ones everyone else had already given up on. He kept his voice level the way he kept it when a technical finding was important enough to require precision. Not because giving up on them was wrong about the damage. It was right about the damage. Every assessment that said broken was accurate. I've never argued with an accurate assessment. He paused. I've argued with the conclusion people draw from it. Broken is not the same as done. Damaged is not the same as undeserving. The objects that had been given up on were not lesser than the ones nobody had questioned. They were just the ones that needed someone willing to look at the damage honestly and decide that honest wasn't the end of the story. She did not look away. You have been carrying the conclusion you drew in 1 second in a burning room, he said, under the highest possible stress, with limited information in a cognitive state that was not the state you used to make accurate assessments. You decided something about yourself in that second and then treated that decision as data rather than reaction. She exhaled slowly. It isn't data, he said. It's a burn mark. And burn marks, in my experience, are not character. The silence that followed was different from every previous silence in the workshop, not full of what had not yet been said, full of what had been. The stillness of a room after something important has finally been given words, the air changed by having held them. Alara looked at the crown. It hovered in its containment field, nearly complete now, the outer arcs restored to their full geometry, the inner lattice rebuilt along its new adaptive architecture, the central gemstone clear and steady. It looked less like a damaged artifact than it had on any previous night. It looked like something that had been through something and had come out of it with more integrity than it had gone in with. "It's almost finished," she said. "Tomorrow," he said, "final calibration and polish. It'll be ready for the ceremony by evening." She nodded slowly. She looked at the crown for a long time, and what she looked at it with was not the expression of any of the previous nights. Not assessment, not weight, not obligation. Something quieter than all of those. Then she turned to leave. At the door, she stopped. She turned back and looked at the crown once more, and then at him, and the look she gave him was the kind of look that does not require annotation. The kind that arrives whole and means what it means without requiring translation. "Good night, Corvin," she said. "Good night," he said. She left. He stood in the workshop alone, and the crown held its calm light above the table, and outside the city of radiance moved through the last hours of its night, steady and patient, the grid running quietly in its distributed channels, the defense lattice, a faint aurora above the upper atmosphere, the whole vast system of it holding together in the way things hold together when they have been built well and maintained honestly and trusted finally to do what they were made to do. He sat down at the work stool. He had one more day. He picked up his tools and continued. The seventh day arrived without announcement, the way the last day of important work always does. Quietly, without the ceremony the occasion might seem to deserve. The system star came over the horizon of radiance and sent its first light through the crystal towers in the usual way, fracturing and redistributing across the city in running arcs of amber and pale gold. And the streets below began their morning movement, and the defense grid ran its dawn calibration across the upper atmosphere in thin ribbons of light that no one on the ground looked up to notice anymore because they had always been there. In the workshop, Corvin Holt stood alone. He had been standing for several minutes without doing anything, which was unusual enough that he was aware of it. His tools were packed. The scanner array had been disassembled and returned to its case in the precise reverse order of how it had come out 7 days ago. The environmental field was still running, holding the room at the temperature and gravity settings he had calibrated on the first night, but he had powered down the projection systems, and without the holographic displays, the workshop was simply a room with good light and a table, and above the table, a crown. He looked at it. The containment cradle held it at eye level, rotating it in a slow quarter-turn cycle so the light could find each facet from multiple angles. The outer arcs rose in their asymmetric spires, each one geometrically precise, the original silhouette preserved exactly as it had stood for 3 centuries. The gemstones caught the morning light and returned it in colors that had no adequate names in any language he knew, somewhere between the blue of deep water and the white of a high-altitude sky, just before full daylight. The central stone was clear. Not merely unclouded, not merely repaired to functional specification. Clear the way a thing is clear when it has been relieved of something it was carrying incorrectly for too long. He ran the final diagnostic from his wrist console. Energy distribution balanced across all channels, no concentration points, no strain signatures anywhere in the lattice. Memory nodes stable, distributed, resonance signatures intact and separated into their proper individual channels, all 9 present and readable without interference. Adaptive filaments, responsive flex modulus within design parameters, stress simulation results holding across every load scenario he had tested. Structural integrity. The fracture line was sealed at the molecular level, the star metal having accepted the repair as fully as old material ever accepts new work, which was not perfectly, but well enough that the difference was academic. He turned off the console. He had repaired objects that had taken longer. He had repaired objects that had been technically more complex in isolated ways. He had never repaired an object that had required this combination from him, the technical precision that went without saying yes, but also the patience to be present in a room where someone else was doing the most difficult work, which was not the work on the table, but the work inside the person standing beside it. He thought about the 6th queen who had looked at a fracture and decided that the cost of repairing it honestly was higher than the cost of carrying it silently, and had made the wrong calculation, not from weakness, but from a belief about what strength required that the people who raised her had installed in good faith and gotten wrong. He thought about Alara standing in this room at 2 in the morning telling him the truest thing she had told anyone in 3 years, and the way the air in the room had changed when she said it. He reached out and touched the crown's outer arc with 2 fingers. The star metal was warmer than ambient temperature, the grid connection running through it, even in the containment field. The planet's distributed energy present in the metal, the way blood is present in a pulse. He felt the faint vibration of it in his fingertips. "You'll do," he said. The chime at the door sounded. "Come in," he said, and stepped back from the crown. Elara entered, and the room changed the way rooms change when a person of particular presence comes into them. Not dramatically, not with announcement, simply by the adjustment of everything else to accommodate the fact of her being there. She was in full ceremonial attire for the first time since his arrival. The layered crystalline fabric fell from her shoulders in structured tiers, deep blues and silvers that caught the light and held it, rather than reflecting it immediately, a material that seemed to absorb what the room offered and return it on its own schedule. Armor plates at the shoulders and forearms etched with sigils he had not seen in her working dress. The formal record of her lineage, written in a language that predated the current alphabet. Cuffs at her wrists traced the line of her alien ears in silver, not concealing them, but framing them the way a good setting frames a stone, by being exactly what it is without apology. He looked at her for a moment. "If the crown malfunctions now," he said, "it will at least have the dignity of doing so in appropriate company." A faint curve at the corner of her mouth. "You have not slept. Sleep is for people who don't have planetary defense systems depending on their calibration work." She moved to the table. She looked at the crown the way she had looked at it every night for 6 nights, but the quality of the looking was different this morning. The weight he had seen in it on the first night, the assessment, the doubt, the arithmetic of whether she was adequate to what it represented, none of that was present in the same configuration. She looked at it the way a person looks at something they have decided about. "Is it ready?" she asked. "It's been ready since last night," he said. "I've been double-checking. And it's still ready." She nodded once. She looked at the crown for another moment. Then she reached out and lifted it from the containment cradle, not waiting for him to present it, not waiting for an attendant, not waiting for any of the ritual protocols that surrounded the handling of the regalia. She simply reached out and took it, the way a person picks up something that belongs to them, and the crown responded instantly to her proximity, light flowing through the veins of the outer arcs in the quiet, steady pulse of recognition. Their hands did not quite touch. Almost. "You will walk with me," she said. "To the ceremony hall," he said, "and then I believe my contribution is complete." "You repaired what holds this world together," she said. "You will witness its return." He considered several responses and selected none of them. He picked up his kit and followed her out of the workshop. The corridor from the workshop wing to the grand ceremonial hall was not the same corridor he had been escorted through on his first day. That route had been efficient, direct, the shortest path between dock and destination. This route was different. It moved through the inhabited parts of the palace, the galleries and transit halls, and open terraces where the morning light came in full and direct through crystal walls. And as they walked, the people they passed did something that Corvin had not seen directed at Elara since his arrival. They looked up, not the practiced attention of court attendants, not the managed observation of officials monitoring a sovereign's movement. The simple, involuntary uplift of a face towards something that has changed in a way the body recognizes before the mind has finished processing it. A senior archivist in a side gallery paused in his morning work and watched her pass with an expression that was not deference but recognition. 2 young technical staff crossing an intersecting corridor stopped and stood, not bowing, just watching the way people watch things they want to remember. Elara did not acknowledge this. She walked as she always walked, with the economy of movement and the settled quality of authority that she had carried since the first morning in the throne chamber. But it was different now in a way that Corvin could not reduce to a single observable variable. The authority was the same. The person carrying it had changed its relationship to its own weight. The grand ceremonial hall was already assembled when they arrived. The space was vast in the way that spaces built for the acknowledgement of history are vast, not incidentally large, but deliberately so proportioned to remind everyone present that the occasion is larger than any individual in it. The dome above was fully transparent, pulling the morning sky of radiance into the room, the defense grid's dawn auroras still visible as faint ribbons against the blue-white atmosphere. the city's towers visible at the periphery, the planet's full luminous weight present as a context for what was happening at the center. Nobles stood in formal arrangement, their robes catching the light in the collective shimmer of a formal court in full attendance. Military commanders in structured uniforms that indicated rank through geometry rather than decoration. Provincial delegates from the outer territories who had come through the night on dedicated transports when the invitation arrived. Engineers and archivists along the side galleries, the technical class of a civilization that had learned to treat expertise as its own form of court position. High Counselor Drabith stood at the head of the formal assemblage, composed and correct his ceremonial robes in full formal configuration, his long ears held at the precise angle that court protocol required on an occasion of this significance. He looked at Alara when she entered. His expression did not change in any way that would be visible to most observers. Corvin, standing behind her left shoulder, saw what changed. Dravith had spent 6 days being wrong about something, and he knew it, and the knowledge of it was present in his face now, in the form of a man who has decided that being wrong honestly is the only dignified response to having been wrong. Corvin took a position to the side of the central aisle, not behind, not among the noble ranks, to the side which was the position of someone present, but not assigned there by decision rather than station. Alara walked to the central dais. She walked the way she had walked through the palace corridors, without theater, without the managed slowing of a ruler performing approach. She simply walked there, and the room rearranged itself around her movement the way a hall rearranges around someone who knows where they are going. She ascended the dais. She stood before the full assembled court of radiance, with the crown in her hands, and for a moment that lasted longer than moments usually last in rooms this formal, she was simply still. He had been watching her for 7 days. He had watched her read schematics at midnight and sit with silence in the hours after the memory nodes had shown her what the lineage looked like in data. He had watched her hold the formal posture of a sovereign through briefings she handled alone and decisions she made without consultation, and mornings she appeared before her court carrying what the 2 in the morning version of herself had admitted was heavier than anyone knew. He watched her now, and he saw the thing he had been watching for since the second night, the thing he had not been certain he would see before he left, which was Alara not performing. Being Alara but simply being her fully without the gap between the role and the person that creates the strain he had seen in her posture on the first day and had been reading the reduction of in small increments ever since. She lifted the crown. She lowered it onto her own head, and no one placed it there, and no one announced the placement, and no one marked the moment with the formal words that the archive protocols indicated should precede the crowning. She placed it herself the way she had taken it from the cradle that morning because it was hers, and she had decided that. The room inhaled, and then the crown activated, and every other consideration became secondary to that. The light did not explode. It did not surge or flare or cascade in the chaotic patterns that the briefing documents had described from the coup's aftermath. It moved the way light moves through a well-designed optical system with purpose and direction, and the quiet authority of something operating within its design parameters for the first time in its proper calibration. Each gemstone ignited in sequence, not simultaneously, but in the ordered progression of a system running its initialization cycle, each one reaching its operating frequency before the next engaged the whole structure, building from the base up in a chain of activations that took approximately 4 seconds, and in those 4 seconds turned the crown from a piece of exceptional metalwork into something that was substantially more than that. The resonance moved outward from the dais in concentric waves that were not visible exactly, but were felt the way a very low note is felt in the chest rather than heard with the ears. Corvin's wrist console registered the energy output and then registered it again because the first reading had seemed improbable. The grid synchronization indicator, which he had been monitoring as a technical courtesy since the 3rd day, moved from its usual partially engaged status to a reading he had not seen in the 7 days of monitoring it. Full synchronization. Not the improved but still compensating numbers of the previous days when the crown had been working, but working against itself when the energy output had been strong, but uneven when the system had been managing the crown's rigidity by building compensatory structures around it, the way a body builds scar tissue around an unhealed wound. Full, clean, the entire planetary grid running in complete resonance with the crown's output, nothing compensating for anything, nothing managing anything, the whole vast distributed system of it operating as designed. He looked up from the console at Alara. She was standing perfectly still on the dais. Her eyes were open. Her ears were in a position he had never seen before, neither the forward angle of attention nor the backward angle of emotion, but straight, fully extended, catching everything equally, the position of a person who is receiving something and is fully capable of receiving it. The auroras outside the dome intensified the defense grid's visible expression of full power operation, moving across the upper atmosphere and spreading arcs of light that the people in the outer districts of radiance would be stopping in their morning routines to watch, tilting their faces up toward a sky that was doing something it had not done in 4 decades. He watched the energy distribution on his console, even across every channel. No concentration points, no strain signatures. The adaptive filaments distributing the load exactly as the simulations had predicted, the whole system flexible and responsive and running the way it was designed to run, which was with a person who was not fighting it but working with it. She raised her hand. The auroras responded, brightening along a specific arc that swept across the city's northern districts, a visible demonstration of directed control that brought a murmur from the assembled court that was not the measured response of formal approval, but the involuntary sound a crowd makes when it witnesses something it did not fully believe it would see. She lowered her hand. The auroras softened but did not collapse. They held at their operational level steady and present the grid fully awake and fully cooperative, waiting for the next instruction rather than straining to maintain the current one. He looked at the energy readings. No strain, no overload, no evidence anywhere in the data that the system was working to compensate for anything at all. He said quietly to the engineer standing nearest him, a young woman from the technical staff who had been staring at her own console with the expression of someone whose mathematical expectations have just been comprehensively revised, "Flexible knees." She looked at him blankly. He did not explain. Dravith stepped forward from the formal assemblage. He moved to the base of the dais and stood there for a moment looking up at Alara, and whatever the formal words were that he was supposed to deliver at this point in the ceremony, whatever the protocol-mandated language of renewal and affirmation that the archive required for this occasion, he did not say any of them. He bowed. Not the court bow, the precise angular dip that indicated formal acknowledgement of sovereign status. Not the deeper bow that indicated ceremonial deference on high occasions. Something else. Something that was less about protocol and more about a man of advanced years and genuine conviction, recognizing that he had been wrong about something important and choosing to mark that recognition in the only way available to him in this room. The court followed, not in the synchronized formal bow of ceremony, but in the organic sequence of a room full of people responding to something real. The provincial delegates first because they had the least investment in the political architecture of the moment, then the military commanders because they understood operational success when they witnessed it, then the technical staff who had the evidence right there on their consoles, and finally the nobles and senior counselors, the people who had the most invested in the old configuration, and therefore the most to acknowledge in watching the new one perform. Alara stood on the dais and received this, and she received it as herself, not as the performed version of herself, not as the queen who had been carrying a burn mark as if it were data, but as the woman who had sat in a workshop at 2 a.m. and said the truest thing she had said in 3 years, and then had come back the next night and the night after that, and had done the harder work of deciding what to do with the truth once it had been said. Corvin noted that his own breathing had returned to normal at some point in the last 2 minutes. He had not been aware of holding it. The formal words of renewal were spoken by the eldest archive keeper, an ancient figure in the back of the hall, whose voice nonetheless carried with the effortless projection of someone who had been filling large spaces with language for decades. The ancient words moved through the room in their ceremonial rhythm, amplified very slightly by the crown's resonance, which gave them a quality they would not have had otherwise, a weight that was not added, but revealed as if the words had always contained this, and the crown was merely making it audible. When the formal portion concluded, the assemblage shifted from ceremony to reception, the 200 people in the room redistributing themselves in the organic movement of a formal occasion, transitioning to informal acknowledgement clusters, forming around the commanders and the delegates and the senior officials. The social geography of a court, working out in real time, who had been right about what and what that meant going forward. Corvin moved toward the edge of the hall. He had done his work. The work was done. There was a shuttle at the eastern spire that was fueled and cleared for departure, and there were 3 commissions waiting for him in the queue that had accumulated while he had been here. A broken astrolabe in a private collection in Vermont, a fractured mechanical seal from an early deep space probe that the Smithsonian wanted restored before a traveling exhibition, and something a private owner in New Mexico had described only as a clock that had belonged to someone important, which in his experience meant it was either very interesting or very sentimental, or both. Corvin, her voice, carrying across the hall with a clarity that the crown's ambient resonance gave it audible to every corner of the room. He stopped. He turned. She had descended from the dais. The crown's light moved with her, not dramatically, not as a performance of significance, but with the steady operational glow of a system that had found its proper working relationship with its energy source. She crossed the hall toward him with the directness she brought to everything she had decided about, and the room adjusted around her movement, the way it had adjusted all morning, the clusters of conversation opening and reforming in her wake. 200 pairs of alien eyes tracking the sovereign, crossing her own hall toward a man standing at its edge with a toolkit over his shoulder. She stopped in front of him. He looked at her, and she looked back at him, and the full weight of 7 days was present in the room around them, without either of them having to name it. "You will not leave without acknowledgement," she said. "A receipt would be sufficient," he said. "Itemized if possible." A ripple moved through the younger nobles nearest them. Not quite laughter, the social equivalent of a caught breath. Elara stood in front of him with the crown on her head and the light of the full radiance defense grid flowing through her and the entire formal court of a sovereign planet, watching from the surrounding space, and she said with the carrying quality of a voice that had spent 3 years learning how to be heard in this room, "He treated this crown not as a relic beyond touching, but as something worthy of honest care. He saw its weakness without calling it failure. He improved what he touched without diminishing what it meant. Radiance does not forget what strengthens it." The hall was very still. He had heard formal acknowledgments before in his work in various contexts and registers and traditions. He had received them with the professional equanimity of someone who understood that what was being acknowledged was the work rather than the person, that the work was the point, that the person was the method the work used to arrive in the world. This was not quite that. He cleared his throat. "Your Majesty, if this is about payment terms," she stepped forward and kissed him. Not theatrical, not constructed for the room. Brief and precise and completely deliberate, the press of her lips against his in the full illuminated center of the grand ceremonial hall of radiance, with 200 members of the court in attendance, and the planetary defense grid running at full power overhead, and the crown on her head glowing with the steady light of a system finally operating as designed. The hall went silent in the absolute way that a room goes silent when something happens that is outside every category the room was prepared to process. Somewhere to the left, something made a sound against the polished floor. A ceremonial staff or a formal document case, or possibly a senior counselor's carefully maintained composure. He could not identify which without looking, and he was not looking anywhere but at her. She stepped back. The color in her cheeks was the only visible evidence that she was not entirely composed, and the composure itself was the composure of a person who has done a thing intentionally and is prepared to stand in the fact of having done it. "Radiance honors those who strengthen it," she said. The carrying voice, the formal register, but underneath it, for anyone listening, carefully something that was not formal at all. He looked at her for a moment. He said, "That was not in the service agreement." From somewhere in the assembled ranks of the court, someone who had been holding a sound and released a portion of it involuntarily. Dravith, at the edge of his peripheral vision, appeared to be reading something extremely important in the middle distance. Elara held his gaze. Her ears were in the position he associated with full attention, fully extended present to everything in the room. She said nothing because she had said what she meant to say, and it did not require elaboration. He straightened slowly. He adjusted the strap of his toolkit on his shoulder. "Next time," he said quietly enough that the words were for her rather than for the room, "I'm accounting for ceremonial variables in my risk assessment." The corner of her mouth moved, the architecture of something that did not need to announce itself. Above them, visible through the transparent dome, the auroras of radiance held their full operational light across the atmosphere, Steady and balanced, the defense grid running at the synchronization level it had not achieved in 40 years. The entire planetary system operating in the relationship it had been designed for, which was a cooperative one, a responsive one, not a compensating one. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at her. Then he walked to the edge of the halls toward the exit corridor because there was a shuttle at the eastern spire, and there were things in the queue that needed attention, and because some kinds of good work are best confirmed by the ability to leave it trusting that it will hold. She did not stop him. The morning was clear on the eastern spire terrace, the system star fully above the horizon, now the light coming in at the angle that turned the city into its most extraordinary version of itself, every tower and terrace and transit lane catching the direct illumination and returning it in the compound brilliance of a world that had been built to do exactly this, to take in light and give it back, transformed. He had set his kit down on the docking platform and was running the pre-departure check on the shuttle's systems when he heard her behind him. He turned. She had come without attendants again, without the ceremonial layers of formal presentation. She had removed the outer robes somewhere between the hall and here, and she stood on the terrace in the structured underlayer, the dark silver blue of her working uniform, the crown still on her head because it was hers, and it went where she went now. Its light steady and low in the morning's brightness, a system at rest rather than a system at ceremony. Her hair was still in its formal braid. Her ears caught the morning light along their elegant length. She looked like herself. "You are conducting a pre-departure check," she said. "Force of habit. Is everything in order?" He checked the console. Fuel at capacity, navigation cleared, weather window for the atmospheric exit is optimal. He paused. "Everything is in order." She nodded. She came to stand at the terrace railing beside him, not quite shoulder to shoulder, but close, looking out over the city the way she had looked out over it on previous mornings from the workshop terrace. Below, Radiance was moving through its daily opening, the transit lanes brightening with morning traffic, the market districts beginning their commerce, the ordinary life of a civilization conducting itself in its ordinary way on top of the extraordinary infrastructure that kept it possible. "The council convened before dawn," she said. "That sounds like the beginning of a sentence that ends badly for someone. It ends with a formal resolution to adopt your adaptive modification principles into the design standards for all future Crown iterations." She paused. "And a secondary resolution to fund an archival documentation project recording the technical methodology." He looked at her. "They want to write it down. They want to ensure it can be done again." He turned this over. He thought about the sixth queen who had chosen not to repair something because the repair would have required acknowledging the damage. He thought about 300 years of accumulated micro-fatigue passed forward through the lineage in a fracture that no one had been willing to look at directly. He thought about what it would mean for that choice to not be available to the next person who stood where Alara stood, because the methodology for doing the honest thing was already documented, already normalized, already part of the design standard rather than a deviation from it. "Tell them to send me the archive team's questions," he said. "I'll answer them." She looked at him. Something in her expression settled the way something settles when a number you are not certain about comes back confirmed. They stood for a moment in the morning light of radiance, and the city moved below them, and the grid ran its smooth operational cycle overhead, and neither of them said anything, because the things that needed saying had been said across 7 nights in a workshop with good light and honest work, and the kind of conversation that happens when 2 people stop performing at each other and simply occupy the same space long enough for something real to develop in the room between them. "Radiance's door stays open," she said, "not as contractor." "What as girl?" She looked at him directly. "Figure that out on the way back." He held her gaze for a moment. He thought about the commissions in the queue, the astrolabe in Vermont, the probe seal for the Smithsonian, the clock in New Mexico, that had belonged to someone important. Good work, all of it. The kind of work that needed doing and that he did well, and that had been the full content of his life for 23 years, and that had been enough, and had been enough, and had been enough until it wasn't. He picked up his kit. "I'll be in contact about the archive documentation," he said. "Yes," she said. "You will." He walked to the shuttle. He did not look back. Not because there was nothing to look at, but because some departures are confirmed by the quality of the forward movement rather than the backward glance, and he wanted this one confirmed correctly. The shuttle lifted from the spire in the smooth vertical arc of a well-maintained craft in optimal atmospheric conditions, and as it rose above the palace complex, the full spread of the city came visible below the crystalline geometry of it, catching the morning light from every angle. Simultaneously, a civilization built over centuries to do something specific with light, which was to take it in and return it transformed. He watched it through the viewport. From this altitude, he could see the grid's operational auroras across the upper atmosphere, thinner now in the morning light than they had been in the darkness, but present, running at full synchronization, the whole vast distributed system of it, holding together in the way things hold together when they have been built well and maintained honestly and trusted finally to do what they were made to do. His wrist console blinked. Incoming transmission. Origin, the Palace Complex, Eastern Spire Communication Relay. He opened it. Ilara appeared in the small display, the crown's ambient glow soft around her, the morning light of the terrace behind her, no ceremony, no formal register, just her framed in the direct way she had looked at him when she said the truest thing she had said in 7 days. "Corvin," she said, "Your Majesty." "The grid is stable?" He looked at the operational readings on his navigation display, which confirmed this, and then looked at her in the transmission, which confirmed something else entirely. "I expected nothing less," he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then, "The archive team will transmit their first set of questions within the week. I'll be ready for them." A pause. The transmission held as quiet, the background hum of a communication relay carrying two voices across the distance that was growing between them as the shuttle continued its climb toward the atmospheric exit window. "Figure it out," she said, "on the way back." The transmission ended. He sat for a moment in the shuttle's quiet. A watch in a museum in Albuquerque kept perfect time because someone had finally stopped winding it past capacity. 9 queens distributed along adaptive filaments no longer collapsed into a single failing point. And a woman had placed a crown on her own head in a ceremonial hall on a planet made of light, and the planet had responded not with chaos, but with the clean harmonics of a system that had been waiting for exactly that. He had arrived to repair a fracture. He left having repaired more than that, though only one of those repairs had required his tools. He pulled up the navigation display. The standard return vector toward the Guild transit hub waited patient and familiar, the route he had filed on the outbound leg from which 3 commissions waited, and from which the ordinary ongoing work of his life could resume in the way it had always resumed after a commission. He adjusted the route. Not toward Radiance, not away from it, toward the hub, yes, because the work in the queue needed doing, and he was the person who did that work. But with a notation in the navigation system for the return vector, a saved coordinate, a point on the map that had a name now. Ahead the stars waited, behind him at a distance that was specific and navigable, and recorded in his system as a saved coordinate, a world he had not expected to matter to him, shone steadily in its own distributed light. He set the course and let the shuttle run.